Working Cows Podcast, episode 299. This episode is brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the C90 Ocean Mineral Studios. Very excited to be joined once again by Burke Teichert. Burke, of course, as you know, is I would say a legend in the ranching industry, having managed more acres than most I know, maybe more than anybody I know of, at least in recent decades for sure. And he is taken on a new role with Understanding Ag as a consultant with them and some of those positions that he's fulfilling there with them. And so Understanding Ag has facilitated this connection to talk with Burke today just about a wide range of topics and about some of the more important things that managers should be paying attention to on their ranches. And this is going to be a two-part conversation with Burke. So we'll release this one, and then, Lord willing, in a couple of weeks on another Friday, we will release another episode of the Working Cows Podcast with Burke Teichert. So looking forward to this conversation. Burke, thanks again for joining me.
Good to be here.
Many of our listeners will know you. I mean, you wrote for a long time for Beef Magazine, and so won't spend too much time on the introduction here, but you are widely recognized as one of the most astute and successful ranch managers in North America. Why is that? What made you a successful ranch manager?
You know, I've thought about that quite a bit, but I think there's just several things. They're all big things and took a while to have happen, but they're important. First of all, there was a change in mindset. Growing up on a family ranch, I got to be pretty pig-headed. If they didn't do things if other people didn't do things the way the Teicherts did it, it just wasn't right. But I had an experience collecting data for my master's thesis when I was a student at the University of Wyoming, just meeting one rancher that totally blew that kind of feeling out of the water. I mean, he was crossbreeding, which we Hereford breeders would never think of doing. And since we sold bulls, he was using AI. We would never think of using AI. Supposed to buy a Teichert bull. But he was getting such fantastic results with beautiful red cows, a cross of Hereford, Angus, and Shorthorn, back in the day when all the continental breeds weren't here yet or were just barely arriving. And after that interview with him that morning, I had to drive back to Laramie, and this was in the northern part of the state. Had to drive back to Laramie that evening, and I just had a long conversation with myself. That basically, the punchline of the conversation was, Teichert, you've got to become open-minded. You're going to have to figure out how to do it without being gullible, but you've got to be open-minded. And while having that conversation with myself, I thought about a lot of opportunities that I had missed to take advantage of the understanding and knowledge of some other people that I'd been invited to listen to them. Nah, they can't teach me anything new. And, with that change in mindset, just that the world there's always a better way, and you need to learn how to do it. And that put in motion a tendency in me to become a lifelong learner. And I think I have done that, become a lifelong learner. And then I began to identify and learn from real good mentors, a lot of them. And I could list a dozen or more that were very helpful to me all along the way from that time on, and probably even before that time. And then the next one probably was as much luck as good management. But I found, or they came to me, real good people, and I was able to facilitate their development, their professional development. And And once that happened, a lot more good ideas and better ways of doing things came from those very people. And I learned that good ideas don't necessarily become because you have a high place on the org chart, nor do they come because you have a high level of intellect. Some pretty plain people aren't particularly gifted intellectually. They're at the bottom of the totem pole on the org chart, but they'll throw out an idea, and once in a while you just kind of hit yourself beside the head and say, gee, why didn't I think of that? Because sometimes they're just that obvious. But I think those things, a change in mindset, becoming a lifelong learner, identifying and learning from real good mentors, and then finding and facilitating the development of real good people to work on our ranches. And I think that's kind of what set me up for the success that I've been able to have.
Yeah, very good. Really helpful, practical stuff there. But when was this shift? When did that take place?
Would have been, if I remember right, it would have been in 1969.
Okay.
Didn't know I was that old, did you?
No, that's good. I mean, really.
I was young, and I'm glad I was, because I needed to have that change, and it happened at a good time in my life.
What were some of the keys to developing those people? Actually, we talked about on episode 100 of the Working Cows podcast, we talked about training the next generation of ranch managers, and you kind of gave your outline at that time of what you thought were some of the things that should be part of that training program. But what were some of the keys to developing really good people?
Well, I've always said that I can't empower anyone. I can facilitate, I can encourage, I can facilitate, and I can reward empowerment. And then I've personally defined the manager's job this way. The manager's job is to create an environment in which people want to excel. And that's not necessarily easy, but do that, and then provide the tools, training, and freedom to do it. So tools come first. Don't expect people to work with inferior tools and expect them to get a good result. So make sure their tools are appropriate, then train. And if you want to manage at a higher level, you can't assume that just because you hired a good cowboy from the work for somebody else, that they're going to have the capability to manage at the level you want to manage. So training is mandatory as far as I'm concerned, and you must train to a higher level. And to not train is unfair to the employee. So you train, and then you give them the freedom to do it once you know they can. And giving people that autonomy for their job, for their responsibility, to just sort of back away and let them do it, that autonomy is every bit as big a reward oftentimes as an increase in pay. And so that's sort of been my approach, to make sure that we've got something there that's attractive to them, that they can feel good about. They can feel, hey, if I do well here, that speaks well of me. I can enjoy it. It looks like fun work. And then give, after you've done that, tools, training, and freedom.
Very good. Is everybody trainable? Are there going to be people that come to you that just don't want to go through that process? And
I think everybody would be trainable if they had the right attitude, but since they don't, and attitudes aren't easy to change quickly, you give everybody the benefit of the doubt, but I don't think everyone's trainable, right at the moment you need them to be trainable. And I only fired 2 people in my entire career, but a lot of them left us simply because they knew they weren't meeting the expectations. And they weren't only my expectations, they were the expectations of their fellow workers. And they knew they weren't meeting their expectations either. And so they just pick the right time and they leave. And frankly, that's a good thing. If they can be happier someplace else, that's great. And we're sure going to be happier without them if they aren't learning.
So what's kind of the venue where everybody gets a chance to share ideas? You said some of the best ideas come from people who aren't necessarily at the top of the totem pole. What was some of the best places or paradigms for them to share those ideas in with the rest of the group?
Every year, I think nearly every year anyway, we'd get to the end of the year, get into the new year, and we had we'd get our year-end financials from the previous year, and we would take a very careful review of those. And we had those done herd by herd, and each one of my full-time people had a herd of their own, and sometimes two. Sometimes a mama cow herd with calves, and then a herd of yearlings, either stock or steers or heifer development heifers. They'd have that herd, and so we did the accounting of the direct costs by herd, so they knew how much feed their cow herd had eaten on a per cow basis and what that had cost. They also could review their pregnancy rate, their weaned calf crop percentage, and their death losses. So how did they perform against the money they had spent for feed and immunizations, et cetera? And so, they got to where they were bunched pretty close, but, they had some freedom there. So sometimes somebody would feed a little less, sometimes somebody would feed a little more. And we'd say, okay, what kind of performance did you get in relationship to what you fed? And we learned from each other from that. But at the conclusion of those kind of discussions, I would say, okay, guys, we'll come back together in 2 weeks' time. And when we come back together, I'd like each of you to bring 3 ideas that answer this question. What would I do if I owned the ranch? And so, 2 weeks later, we would meet. You had 15 people. You'd expect 45 ideas, right? Well, it never was. It was more like 20 out of 15 people. And you'd think, gee, what's happened here? And we found, I don't know that they'd been talking to each other, but they'd sure been thinking a lot alike. And we had fairly frequent meetings, and we reviewed financials together, and they knew what was going on our ranch. And as a result, they'd come up with a pretty good bunch of ideas, only not near as many as I had anticipated, at least when we first started that drill. So we'd list their ideas, list them on a whiteboard, and then I'd actually give them a star, like the kids in kindergarten get put on their forehead or whatever. And I'd say, okay, you're gonna vote 5 stars, and you vote them one at a time. So everybody goes and votes once, and put it on your idea that you think is the most important for us to discuss. And you vote one at a time. So if your idea, one of your favorite ideas, is lagging behind, you can put more stars on it as you go. And and so they'd use their stars, and then after they do that, and it's amazing because not more than 5 or 6 of those ideas ever got a lot of stars. And then those ideas, someplace between 3 and 5 ideas, we would really dig into, and we would, first of all, what are all the good things that could happen if this idea worked? And you go through the good things. Okay, now we do have to wear the black hat. How bad could it be if it didn't work? And how would we recognize that it wasn't working in time that we cut it off before it cost us a lot of money? And go through that kind of a drill. How do we facilitate it if we decide to do it? So it's a low-risk facilitation. And typically, we would kick out some ideas, and usually you'd get pretty good consensus around that. No, that idea, even the person that brought it up, I think I've seen it a little more clearly here. That idea is not going to work. But oftentimes we'd get a nice consensus around an idea, and we'd say, okay, we're ready to do this. And I made sure that they always knew that we were in the boat together. I wasn't going to leave them hanging out to dry because their idea didn't work if it didn't work. We all said, hey, we're going to give it a try. We think it's a worthy idea. Let's give it a shot. And usually we would give that idea to the person who brought it up and say, okay, you try that in your herd for 1 year. And let's see how it goes. I cannot remember a single one of those ideas that didn't work.
Hmm.
So I think we were probably too tough on ourselves. We probably should have let a few more of those ideas come to the front, because our success rate on those ideas was really good. And a lot of it had to do with supplemental feeding. How much, how little? Can we cut it back? Can we give more? Do we change the timing? Some things on marketing and heifer development. There were all kinds of ideas that came out. That got us in the mode of selling bred cows, which and a short heifer breeding season, and a whole bunch of things that I've advocated over the years. But those ideas came from those discussion groups, and some of them turned out to just be economically powerful. And like I say, kind of hit yourself side the head and say, why didn't I think of that? And long ago. But it took somebody bringing it to the front and a little discussion to bring it into clarity and then move forward with it.
That's really good. Do you have a sense of how many ideas in a given year, like you said, 20 were thrown out in those meetings? Would it be one each year that got implemented on somebody's ranch, or would you have multiple, or in somebody's herd, or would you have multiple ideas each year that were being experimented with in different herds?
That varied a little from year to year. We were pretty tough on ourselves, and like I say, probably tougher than we should have been. But no, I'd say any place between 1 and 3 ideas that were that we looked at as a result of those meetings each year, and next year another group of maybe that many, 1 to 3.
Cool, very good.
And so it took a while, but just getting that 5 people are smarter than 1, even if 1 is a genius, and just getting that group participation, and the ideas can come from any place, and try not to make anybody look like an idiot because of a dumb idea. And there's some dumb ideas come out of those things, you have to admit. And some of them you almost like to laugh at. You have to watch yourself to do that. But that same person might have a real good idea too. So don't do anything that would stifle the idea of creativity. Let them keep coming forward.
What do we as ranchers need to manage? I think that there's always probably opportunity to manage more than we need to, but what's the baseline? What are some of the most important things that ranchers need to manage?
Well, once you have been told that you're a manager, or you have described yourself as a manager, say a self-employed manager, you have your own place, or you work for someone else and they've hired you as their manager, doesn't matter. If you are the manager of a project, an idea, or whatever, where you go all the way to bottom line responsibility. If you have bottom line responsibility, then you must manage production. And most of us love production, so we'll spend more than enough time at that usually. Sometimes it's not as well spent as it ought to be, but we'll spend time there. Then we must manage economics and finance. We must manage marketing, and we must manage people. And when I say people, I want to be a little cautious. Sometimes as a consultant, I've worked with kind of small ranches, and they say, and I've given these talks to people where there's all kinds of ranches represented in the audience, and somebody will say, well, gee, there's just me and my spouse and a couple of kids. Why do I need to worry about managing people? And I'll suggest 2 things. First of all, sometimes managing people in a family relationship, you have a family relationship and you have a business relationship, and sometimes that's not real easy. So learning how to manage people in the business setting and still keeping the family relationships like you want them to be can be a real challenge. And beyond that, the next thing about people management is that we all have people with whom our business interacts, people that sell to us and people to whom we sell, and people who give us advice, a feed salesman, banker, a tax accountant, and so on. I could make a long list of those, but a lot of those people are pretty bright people. And I'd like to invite the ones that really appeared to come across as good and interested to our ranch to come see us, see what we're doing. And good ideas can come from those people the same as they can come from your employees. Or sometimes those people can help you refine a good idea and make it better. And so not only do you manage people, you also manage relationships that include people. So managing the relationships is oftentimes more important than managing the people, actually. But I think when I talk about people, and that's why they're on the list, it's very, very important that we manage people. And we need to train. And that's part of people management. And if you don't train, if you can't teach, you're going to have a hard time being a good manager.
Yeah, and on that people management front, a couple of things there. I've said it a lot of times, but it is just it was just such a great thing that Dallas Mount said all the way back on episode 2 of the Working Cows podcast, that the greatest barrier to success in ranching is without a doubt people management, and lack of people management in ranching usually is what leads to issues as far as successful ranch management. So kind of echoing those things. And then the next episode that I'll be releasing after this one is an episode with quoted on that second episode of the podcast as well. So it's been, a consistency theme throughout the entire history of this podcast that we talk about managing people. And I think that's important. But in your experience, what's more important, or would you say one is more important than the other as far as keeping good people around? Is salary or autonomy more important as far as keeping good people around?
I have real trouble differentiating that. You have to be fair with all your people, and you've got to keep salaries in line from person to person. And, we sort of had a method of promoting within a position, because there was me and a foreman and cowboys. And the cowboys, we had several levels of cowboys depending on what their capabilities were at the moment, and they were very well of what it took to progress within that cowboy title, if we can call it that. But I think salary and autonomy, I can't differentiate which is more important. In the long run, if people don't gain a certain amount of autonomy, they're not going to stay with you. And on the other hand, if you don't pay people fairly and appropriately, they're not going to stay with you either. And one of the most difficult things I had to deal with is some of our people would develop real well, and they were capable, ready to be moved up a level to, in our case, our foreman level. And the only way I could promote them was to fire a foreman that was already pretty darn good. And so I'd usually go to those people and I'd tell them just where I was with them and where they stood. And I said, look, you've got the capabilities. If you find a job someplace else, or if you're looking for something someplace else, I will surely recommend you. Much as we'd hate to have you leave, I will recommend you and do it without problem. And I did that on several occasions. And the people came to me and they said, hey, he's applied here and he said you'd recommend him. And I said, yeah, I will. And I said, and we don't necessarily want to lose him, but on the other hand, we don't want to discourage you from hiring him. And he has the capabilities to move up. And if we had the position, he'd have it. Mm-hmm. But we don't have the position. And, 3 or 4 of those people and those relationships were good the rest of my career, and theirs too in some cases. And I think that just made us look a little more like the employer of choice. Somebody thinking about coming to work with us and thinking, gosh, if they can't promote me as I show my stuff and I prove to them that I'm good, why, maybe it's a stepping stone to move someplace else. And so while there's some negatives to losing people that way, I think there's more positives than negatives.
Sure.
But autonomy and salary, it's hard to differentiate. They're both important.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. I appreciate that for sure. You said that we love to talk about managing production. Do you think that sometimes our production management, it could be better spent? It's what we love to do, but could it be better spent by thinking outside the box in some cases, or some of those things? Well,
certainly. One of my early introductions, and that happened back in, I think, 1977, if I remember right, was I was invited to speak at an international stockman school, and I think it was Alan Savory's first time to speak in the United States. Mm. He and I were speaking on the same program, and there were lots of lectures every hour. And then any given lecture, though, had free time, and we were able to go to any of the things we wanted to. And I missed Savory's first lecture. But as I walked by the room where he'd lectured, coming out of mine, a friend of mine says, "Did you hear this guy?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, you need to listen." "Well, what's his name?" "Well, his name's Savory." "Oh," I said, "I think I noticed that. He's that ecologist?" "Yeah." "Well, I'm not listening to the ecologists." See, pig-headedness. But anyway, I did. I went and listened to him the next time he talked, and it was a very interesting listen. He reviewed the stuff he'd talked about the first day, and they were the ecosystem processes. And I knew a bunch of range management people in that room, and while he was talking about processes, they all were nodding their head yes. The reason he reviewed is he said there are a lot of different people in here that weren't here yesterday, and he said, "I need to set this up before I move on." So he reviewed them fairly briefly, but all these heads are nodding yes. He says, "Now I want to propose a grazing method," called it a method, not a system, a grazing method that caters to, that's kind of from Zimbabwe, I guess, those 4 ecosystem processes. And then he flashed on the board his old original wagon wheel, or, with the paddocks radiating out from a cell center, and starting to describe how he used that, and all these heads start going no. They start shaking no instead of yes. And I thought, wait a minute. If what he said about those processes are right, I had never taken any ecology. I didn't understand ecology at all at the time, I've got to admit. But I said, if what he described to us in those ecosystem processes, if that's right, this grazing method can't be completely off the mark. Well, learning that really got me interested in the economics and finance of the thing. And also he helped me kicked me into becoming a holistic thinker or a systems thinker. And I think I was blessed with a little bit of natural ability to be a systems thinker. Gabe Brown is blessed with that too. And I have the fortune of working with some people. To some people, that doesn't come naturally. I mean, they are so ingrained linear that to become a systems thinker or holistic thinker is really difficult for them. But to be a real top-notch manager, we have to do that. And so, that kind of kicked that off for me.
Yeah, really appreciate that. What about marketing? You mentioned marketing was one of the things we manage.
Well, marketing's a marvelous thing. And I guess I learned it first in what I was calling cull cows. I finally learned that I was leaving a lot of dollars on the table. And then as I got better and better at it, I was leaving a lot more dollars on the table. And it was one of our group discussions that we talked about earlier. We were struggling to get stocked up. We bought several ranches in a row in Nebraska, and we just couldn't stock up. And we used to joke that if she can walk and get pregnant, she gets to stay here. Well, finally, we kind of reached our stocking, our carrying capacity, and didn't need all these cows anymore. And so we started asking questions. Well, what do we do? Do we start selling these old cows that can still walk and get pregnant? Or do we do something else? And how do we breed all these heifers? And somebody said, well, tell you what, why don't we just breed the heifers for 30 days and see what gets pregnant? And then if we've got more heifers than we need to replace the herd, why don't we sell the least desirable cows or the later calving cows, which will shorten our calving season? And we started doing that. Within 2 or 3 years' time, we were selling a lot of bred cows because we were getting a lot of those heifers pregnant. From then on, that became our modus operandi. Expose basically every heifer that was born on the ranch and sell every cow that hadn't calved in the first 30 days. And that kind of kept us about right. Now, that wasn't fixed in place because naturally some years you could cull a few more and some years you could cull a few less or sell a few less to stay stocked up. In drought times, you had to cut back more, you sold more. And oftentimes when it was droughty, we'd even sell some of the development heifers. But anyway, we just worked with a lot of marketing alternatives, and we just learned that there was a lot of ways to sell cattle. A cull cow isn't just necessarily a cull cow. Oftentimes, what's a cull to me is a pretty good cow to somebody else. And we learned that a lot of ranchers should be terminal mating and never raising any of their own replacement heifers, just buy cows and breed them. They'll be more profitable than the guys that are doing the maternal side most of the time. And I know that because we did both, kept good records on both. And if I couldn't mark and we moved cows from one of our ranches to the other, and if I couldn't move them at a pretty good price and charge that other ranch a pretty good price for them, they'd make more money as a terminal crosser than we would as a maternal breeder. And so I've always said the maternal guys, if they can't sell bred cows at a premium, they can't be as profitable as terminal crossing people can.
Sure.
And it's, and I've run the arithmetic enough times to know that's why we have to consider economics and finance.
For sure. Yeah. And that's the next one on the list that we haven't covered yet as far as the things that we need to manage. And so what are the major determinants of financial success in your experience?
It's hard to rank these, and so I haven't tried, but enterprise mix and choices of enterprises is very important. And I think in some of your previous podcasts with Alan and Gabe, you've talked about that as part of diversity. If we can have different classes of livestock, or the choice of the class of livestock. In other words, I just mentioned that terminal crossing operation is usually more profitable than a maternal operation where you raise your own replacement heifers. Carrying your own yearlings over instead of just selling a weaned calf, especially if you calve at a sensible time of the year, carrying the yearling on over is oftentimes a very good use of resource. Yearlings will usually convert grass to dollars better than cow-calf pairs will. The difficulty with that is if you want the yearlings to really perform, you're not going to ask them to eat near as much of the feed as you do a cow-calf pair, for example. And so where you graze with yearlings one year, you might put cows and calves there the next and vice versa, flip-flopping. And we were in a part of the country where rarely did you graze the same piece of ground twice in the same year. It was once a year. And so the enterprise mix had to sort of fit. Or am I just a yearling operator, a stocker operator? Do I add sheep, goats, poultry? Those are all questions that need to be asked. And actually, and I hate to say this because I love cows and calves, and it's been my life, but I had to work hard to make them as profitable as I wanted them to be. And usually they're at the bottom of the totem pole on those choices of enterprises that you could put on a ranch. And if you just wanted to make the most money, they might be the last. A maternal cow-calf operation might be the last enterprise you put there. However, you can make them profitable. And so, if you sell bred cows, you can make them nicely profitable. But that mix and the choices of those enterprises really is very important economically. And if you're flirting with the edge for profitability, in other words, if your ranch is flirting with the edge of making money or not making money, it becomes an extremely important choice.
Do you think that a lot of that is geographically determined, that some of the places that we try to do cow-calf would be more profitable if we emphasize something else?
I won't say a lot of times it's geographically, but oftentimes it is. For example, I've worked with ranches that, they're feeding hay 6 months of the year, and not just because they want to, but because they don't have a whole lot of choice. They just snow depth, and that country should never be cow-calf country. Back in the day, maybe when you could put up hay inexpensively with tractors and fuel, it didn't cost a lot of money, and your labor was your family labor, your kids, and maybe you could do the hay cheap enough that you could make that work. But in this day and age, it doesn't work. And so there's places that you've either got to be able to move the cows away, go to some farmland and put them on corn stalks for the wintertime, and then come back in the summertime, or you just need to run stalkers on those kind of ranches.
Sure. I really appreciate that. Yeah, real good. What are some of the other things?
Kind of proceed through the list here if I can.
Yep.
Overheads. And anybody that's taking the Ranching for Profit School recognizes that. And, overheads are those costs that they don't, well, there are two categories of overheads. First of all, there's land and the facilities that are attached to it, and the maintenance of those facilities. That's all overhead. And then people, their salaries, their tools, and equipment. Well, so most of our costs in the cow-calf business or cattle business are overheads. And so we need to recognize that. And those are an either-or decision. Either we need them or we don't. And the ranches that I've seen that have made the most rapid progress when they knew they were in trouble from a profit and loss standpoint, if they would really be honest with themselves about overheads and get rid of all the overheads that they did not need. And sometimes adaptive management helps with that quite a bit too, and adaptive grazing, we'll get to that a little later. But getting rid of the overheads that they do not need moves them from a loss to profit right away. And then after overheads, you've got stocking rate. Two things determine stocking rate. One is cow size and the milk production ability of that cow. And if you want that cow to be too big or want her to give too much milk, she's not going to breed as well, just a lot of things. But a smaller cow that gives less milk, you can run more of them on the same forage. And yes, a smaller cow will wean a smaller calf, but not proportionally smaller. You will wean more pounds per acre with smaller cows than you will with bigger cows. So that's important. Then grazing and pasture management. And we'll get to more of that later, but grazing and pasture management, in previous podcasts, you've talked about that, but that's the big lever. That's one of the biggest levers of all in terms of pasture, in terms of profitability. And fed feed versus grazed feed. Anytime you put a machine between the mouth of the cow and her feed source, it's just cost money. And the more days you can graze and the fewer days you have to feed, the better off you are. And that doesn't matter where you are. If you can reduce those fed days. I'm working the ranches right now in Wyoming. One of them we had to feed quite a little this last winter. It snowed a lot, more days than we cared to, but the other one didn't have to feed one single day. And that's pretty cool. I mean, the cows got some protein supplement, but they didn't get fed. Mm-hmm. Oh, no hay hauled to them, just grazed. And so that's important. Calving season, choice of calving season is important for all kinds of reasons. One, it allows you to graze a lot of the year. If I'm trying to calve in February or March, in a lot of the country I've managed in, a lot of country north of I-80, and all of it almost north of I-70, if you want to calve in February and March, you got to remember that cow's nutrient requirement almost doubles the day her calf is born. I don't think you can throw enough hay. If you can, you can't afford it to let that happen calving at that time of the year. If you choose to calve later and let Mother Nature take care of that increase in nutrient requirement, you're just a whole lot better off. It just saves you all kinds of money, not to speak of the facilities to calve in, the manpower to calve, when who should be calving, us or the cows? I used to talk about calving heifers. They're supposed to calve, not us. And if you pick the calving season right, they can calve and reduce all kinds of costs, overhead and direct. And it just makes a world of difference. And it gives you some wonderful marketing opportunities as well. Then after calving season, herd fertility, I'd like to talk about realized herd fertility, actually. For every cow, ideally, you'd have something to sell that year. We know that they're not all going to get pregnant, and they're not all going to have a live calf if they do get pregnant, and that things will die along the way. But the better your herd fertility, realized herd fertility is, the more profitable you will be. And so if we manage for that in the context of these other things, now it all has to be optimized. You still have to be that systems thinker, that holistic thinker. Say, okay, if I let this slip, how much are we going to give up on another place? We get to wise use of inputs for optimum production. And that's just, how do you use, like the feed supplements that I've talked about? What's too much? What's not enough? I like to think that if I'm going to use any kind of an input to cattle, feed supplement, whatever it might be, another injection, I want at least $2 back for every dollar I spend, and I want it to be obvious that I can get it. And people say, well, why? If you get $1.10 back for every $1.10 back for every dollar spent, you're profitable. You've increased profit. And I said, yeah, but what if my estimate of how much increased production I was going to get is wrong? I want to have at least enough to cover for poor estimating, because in agriculture, we don't estimate very well. It's not our fault necessarily. It's just that we're in a situation, a biological situation, where things aren't highly predictable. And not only in a biological situation, but it's buffeted by climate, which makes it even less predictable. So I want to have at least 2 for 1. I'd like it even be higher than that, 3 to 5 for 1.
Well, you think about it. Just we can pick numbers. Like a lot of people say, every number I pick will be wrong. But just let's just say, in this scenario, we're talking about $100,000 investment in feed. If you get 10 cents back, if there's a $10,000 error in your estimate, then you lost. You're losing money at that point. But if you're getting $1 back, there's got to be a $100,000 error in your estimate. Is there a $100,000 error in your estimate? Probably not. So now you've got a lot more room to work with there.
Yeah, right. And so, that to me, that just becomes really important. And the other thing is, cows sort of become addicted to the way they're treated and handled. And if I get them used to a certain level of supplementation, and all of a sudden the price of that doubles, triples, quadruples, and I jerk that away from them because I can no longer afford it, the cow just doesn't go merrily along producing the same way she did. She's dependent, at least for a while. Some of the cows in that herd are dependent on that supplement to get pregnant again and to stay healthy and to produce a good calf. So I don't want them. That's another reason I want a good payback, because the cows get used to having it, get accustomed to having it. And if you no longer have it, you're in trouble. So that's pretty important. The other thing you notice and I don't mean to pick on anybody, but the feed sale, and I think they're trying to do an honest job, but the feed salesman comes and tries to sell you, and they tell you, okay, you feed this much feed and you're going to get this much increase in production. And the market for calves is $1.80, or today it's $2.05 or whatever. Therefore, you're going to get that for every additional pound. And I say, wait a minute. Value again is never the market price. If you look at the incremental change from 400 weight to 500 weight to 600 weight, rarely is the value of gain much over $1, no matter what the market price is. And they have trouble backing away in that argument. Matter of fact, I had one guy, he got mad at me for even suggesting such a thing. He thought I was crazy and didn't know what I was talking about. But the value of gain is never the market price. And so, okay, and the last one on my list of key determinants of financial success is marketing. And marketing just has so much power, and there's so much room to do it better.
Yeah, and we've talked about some of that for sure, but obviously could be a whole episode in and of itself. But we've got some ground to cover here today, so we'll keep on moving. What key ratios drive profitability in your experience?
I use a summary slide. Some of the people that have heard me talk have seen the slide. And it basically says this: if you reduce overheads as much as you can, and then increase turnover, and that means you have more to sell for the size of your ranch. And that relates to better grazing, better management of the soil, having more stuff to sell without abusing it. And so you reduce overheads, increase turnover, then market well. Then you improve 3 key ratios that are really important. Now, again, got to be a systems thinker here now. You're going to reduce acres per cow. I've got a good friend in Montana. He started out, it took 30 acres to run a cow-calf pair. Now it takes 16. He says the cows are bigger, so he said, I've at least doubled what I can carry. And he said, we're heading to do better than that. But he said, in addition to that, I don't feed near as much hay as I used to feed. And he said, so I've think how much more revenue I get off of double the number of cows that I run on my ranch. And he said, I'm feeding less hay, not more hay, less hay per cow. So my gross margins even increased. He said, I didn't have to add a pickup. I didn't have to add a saddle horse. I didn't have to add an employee. I didn't have to add anything except some fence and water. And he said, I spent about $50 an acre in water development, stock water development, and fence materials. And he said, it seemed like a lot of money given the size of my ranch at the time I was doing it. But he said, tell me where else in Montana I can buy a ranch for $50 an acre. And I don't have to pay property tax on this second one because it sits right on top of the first one. And so acres per cow, it's huge. He said, the only thing I have to change is on days that we work cows because there's twice as many to work, brand, ship, preg check. He says, it's not more than 4 times a year at the most. I have to have either more people or we've got to stay longer. And he said, we day trade, we trade for day work or we pay for day work, either or we just stay longer ourselves. But he says, it's just on cow working days that the labor requirement goes up. So think of the economic power of that, changing that acres per cow ratio. The next one is cows per FTE or cows per full-time equivalent. And I used to expect my cowboys to run about 800 cows. Plus, they might have a herd of yearlings. It could be 500-ish, thereabouts. If that guy can run 800 cows and somebody else only has 200 cows, if they want to be competitive, they better learn to run 200 cows on about a quarter of their time.
1 day a week.
They need to spend the rest of their time doing something else that can earn income for them, because you just got to allocate less to the cows if you want to be competitive. So cows per FTE, and the bigger the herd, the better. And I'm not afraid to go to 1,000. Just 800 happened to do 2 things for us. One, we were pumping wells with solar pumps in the Sandhills of Nebraska, and that just about took care of our water capacity for 1 well and a 30-foot ring tank. And we kept our heads above water, kept the cows watered with that, without having to do a lot of overnight generator work. The other thing it did is it was a nice sized bunch to brand in one branding shift quickly, and a nice size to pregnancy check. We could easily get them done in a short order and then back out and distribute it where we wanted. And we were making a lot of other decisions when we were pregnancy checking. Off the end of the preg shoot, we were setting up next year's herds. So anyway, cows per FTE. If you can have one person take care of a lot of cows, again, just think of that. The cost of a person is not just a salary. I don't know what cowboys demand nowadays, but let's say you're paying one $40,000, $45,000 a year. And, but that's not all. If you house them on your ranch and pay their utilities, if you put them in a vehicle, if you keep some saddle horses for them, either yours or theirs, but you're paying for their upkeep, you put a set of tools at their disposal so they can do their job, you pay your share of the Social Security, the unemployment comp, et cetera, pretty soon that $40,000, $45,000 a year employee is costing you over $100,000. So you've got to spread that across a few cows to make it work. And so how do you do that? I used to tell our people, you're going to have to run a lot of cows, and we don't expect you to work harder or longer, but we do expect you to work real smart, and we'll try to help you be real well organized. And so that's kind of what it requires there. And then the last ratio. So you got acres per cow, cows per full-time equivalent of labor, fed feed versus graze feed. Those 3 ratios all just have huge power.
Yeah. So on the acres per cow issue, in your experience, would you say that most ranches are overstocked or understocked?
It probably depends on how you looked at it. For the way they're grazing, they're probably overstocked. But, Hal and Savory coined the term, I think, or the expression, understocked and overgrazed.
Right.
And if they get the grazing right, they are understocked. And if you look at their ranches, they have undergrazing and overgrazing occurring in the same pasture all of the time. Well, not all the time. Some of them leave their cattle there so long they finally get it all overgrazed. But a lot of ranches have, a lot of them pay attention. They bought into the idea that you can cure all of the grazing problems with stocking rate, and that is not true. Just put less cows in the pasture and you'll be okay. And the fewer cows you put there, the more overrested areas you're going to have, and the bigger they're going to be. Unless the areas you've overgrazed, you've hurt so bad that they're no longer productive. To look at it realistically, I would not add cows immediately as I changed my grazing.
Yeah.
But I think, and you might even have to reduce numbers a little bit just to get going. But you're not going to go very long, and you're going to be understocked.
So as you've taken over ranches in the past, how have you started? How have you determined where to start as far as stocking a ranch, and at what rate?
I took a quick look at the ranch, and if it looked like it had not been abused, I stocked it about the way it had been stocked when we took it over. And then as we began to graze better, we just let feed residual tell us, we're moving ahead of schedule. We don't have to move. We're moving just because it's time to move. And we're not taking as much feed as we could be taking without hurting the environment. And so observation just tells you, hey, I can run more cows as long as it keeps raining the way it has been. And then you're doing things that are making the soil better, making the productivity better as you go.
So you mentioned early on that one of the key determinants of financial success was overheads. And sometimes I think it's helpful to really define those terms and the difference between overheads and direct costs. So can you explain the difference there?
Okay, let me talk first of all. Well, overheads, and I kind of described those before. They're land and the structures attached to them and the maintenance of those structures. And then the other class of overheads are people and the tools and equipment required to do their jobs. That ends up being the bulk of the cost in cattle operations. And those are either yes or no decisions. Either you need it or you don't. Now, the other costs are direct costs. And those are costs that vary every time you vary the number of animals. Okay, if I add 10 cows to that herd, and if I'm given a certain herd health protocol, every animal is going to get that protocol. So we need to add that many more injections. If I'm feeding a certain amount of a protein supplement to every cow, I've got 10 more cows, I need to add that much more to take care of the protein supplementation. So there are those costs that vary strictly in proportion to the number of animals. Now, there's some marketing costs, and especially for those people who do direct marketing costs, that will be on a per head basis. So those marketing costs there, or if you take the cattle to an auction and sell them there will be per head marketing costs. And so they're the costs that vary directly in proportion to the number of animals you have. And if you will look at those that way and expect your direct costs to make a good return to you, like at least 2 for 1 or better, you're going to keep yourself clean there. And then the overhead costs, you just have to say, do I need it or don't I? And the ranchers that I've seen that have made the most progress, the quickest, have taken care of overheads right away. And I could give you dozens of names that have done that. And matter of fact, some of them will tell you they were on the verge of bankruptcy until they cleaned up their overhead situation and started to graze a lot better.
Did that usually look like selling equipment, cleaning up the overhead situation? Yeah,
it did. Selling equipment. Yeah, that's what and sometimes reducing workforce, and that's not a pleasant thing to talk about, but sometimes one guy I know, he said he started to attack the overheads. He'd taken over management of a place that had been just historically losing money. And he's become a very well-known manager. He's very, very good. He tackled the overheads and he started saying, okay, what tractors can we get rid of? What pickups? And he said, a good number of our people, they thought I was crazy. And he said, they just quit. He said, I was lucky. The right ones quit. And he said, we didn't need all those people. And so I didn't have to fire anybody. And I liked his term. He was lucky. The right ones quit.
Yeah. If you,
and the ones that could buy into what he was doing stuck around and saw it. And so, and he said, once we got that initial thing done, we were profitable. He says, we still continue to work with that. What do we need in the way of overheads? What's the proper complement of tractors? What's the proper complement of pickups or side-by-sides or four-wheelers to do the work we have to do on our ranch? And so they still ask fine-tuning questions about that, but they know they got to keep that overhead complement skinny. And, I asked him how he made the change so fast from loss to profit. And he just grinned at me, says, he'd worked for me for a number of years, and a young manager. And he said, and I looked at him and I said, overheads? And he said, yep. He said, now we got, that was the low hanging fruit. He says, now we got other stuff to do.
Very good. Well, I think we're going to end up doing 2 episodes here today. And so just to kind of put a bow on this first one, because I think this is a good place to hit the pause button. What I'd like you to do is, when I talked to you on episode 100 of the Working Cows podcast, I think you were just starting your relationship with Understanding Ag at that time. And you mentioned on there just the power of the Soil Health Academy and some of those things. So can you tell me a little bit about your continued work with Understanding Ag and kind of how you have seen that Soil Health Academy grow and mature, and some of the power of that opportunity for continuing education?
There's nothing except perhaps excellence at a high level in marketing. And that has to involve direct marketing, and you've got to be good at it. That has any more financial power than does soil health. Now, sometimes it is biology, and it's buffeted by climate. And the speed of it is somewhat affected by rainfall. But you can make so much progress. Back when I talked about the determinants of profit, stocking rate is one of the major determinants of profit. Now, we can abuse stocking rate and it can tear down profit. But still, the more you can run that's just turnover. And so if you can get more turnover, that's more stuff to sell on the same size of ranch. And that is what soil health that comes as a result of excellence in grazing management can do for you. There's just nothing else more important, so you want to reduce your overheads, increase your turnover, and that all affects acres per cow. And because your herd sizes are bigger, you end up running more cows per person, per employee. And most grazers then start figuring out, we don't have to feed these cows all these months. We can graze them a good portion of this time. First of all, the time that something green and growing is there elongates. And in addition to that, you've got tall standing feed that you can work through a fair amount of snow to graze. And then in the next spring, when the snow comes off, if you did get snow, but new green starts to come, you don't just have to sit there and camp on that new green to keep from having to feed cattle. You've got a stockpile of previous year's growth that can be grazed to let the new growth come. And so, it's powerful. It's huge. Nothing, I hate to admit this. I came along too late. I always loved cows, grew up loving cows, and I just figured range management is just a way to grow more grass. And if I have more grass, I can grow more, have more cows. It took me too long to recognize that we were doing things if we were grazing correctly, we're doing things in the soil. And that's what pushed it all. That's what drove it all. So we had to get to where we had soil health. So my way of looking at things, it used to be cows, grass, and soil, and now it's soil, grass, cows. Working to a market endpoint, but starting with the soil.
Right. Yep. And you talk about cows per FTE and just doing some, back of the envelope math here. I think that most ranches around that I'm aware of would probably be closer to that, 1 to 200, probably more like 100 cows per FTE. And, you're talking about 800 cows per FTE. So I think that's a big change, a big shift that people have to look at. And then you start to look at, well, then we're going to have to probably downsize our workforce, which is something that you've mentioned. But one way to start turning that in your favor, turning that ratio in your favor, is to increase soil health, and you can graze more cows on the same number of acres, and probably through good stockmanship do it with fewer people helping you on some of the move days, but then on some of the big cow working days you bring in those others, the other extra help. So it all starts to fit together, right?
Oh, well, I know a lot of guys that are running between 200 and 400 cows, and they don't have an employee. It's the wife once in a while and the kids, depending on the age of the kids. And they figure out how to simplify that. Even when it gets down that the kids aren't as available anymore, they find some neighbors they can trade a little work with, and they're a one-man show most of the time.
Right.
With 200 to 400 cows. And if they get, the area 200 cows or less, they're taking care of those in the evenings and on Saturday, and going to the church on Sunday and spending time at a day job, or else they create their own day job. They're shoeing horses, or they got some leftover equipment that they don't need, but they still have it, and they're putting up hay for somebody else that they then can buy some of that back when they don't need it themselves or whatever else. But they figure out ways to make money in addition to running their cows, if they're at that 200 cow deal. 200 cows, even well run, is a pretty poor income. But let's say you got 200 cows, and now I can double, maybe even triple my carrying capacity. And as that comes, then I can start thinking too, okay, I can add a sheep, or I can add a goat. I can add at least one. I can add a ewe for every cow and never miss the cow feed.
Mm-hmm.
Now, goats, I might, if I got many woody species, I might even be able to add cows because of what the goats help me do. Got to be a little cautious about that because there's a delicate balance in there. But, and then I can add poultry. And if you can figure out how to market that stuff wherever you live, you can start to generate a pretty darn good income where you just used to run 200 cows. But now I've got a carrying capacity that's double, maybe even as much as triple, and I can add other species, which oftentimes are more profitable on a per animal unit basis, the equivalent of a 1,000-pound cow, a per animal unit basis. I'm adding things there that are making more money than the cows were. So all of a sudden, you can make this smaller ranch become what you might call a real ranch, not just your hobby that you're doing in your off hours.
Yeah, very good. Burke, can you tell me a little bit about some of the continuing education stuff that Understanding Ag has going on, just from your experience and your perspective on it, some of that you've been exposed to?
Well, it's all good. The Regen Ag 101, that's their online course. And then they have a little more advanced grazing course that follows that. Their academies are excellent, very well done. They vary a little depending on it, but the way they title them and where they house them, and you look at the curriculum, it'll sort of tell you, where they lean more for farming, more for grazing, more for dairying, more for this kind of thing or that kind of thing. They'll all have a little different slant. They're not terribly expensive. And so you can take one and, I always learned more from the repeats. I didn't care what class or school I went to. I learned more from the repeats than I did from the first time through anyway. So, those are all good. They're continuing education, and then just their website and the stuff that their experts are putting up. It's just good stuff. And so you can look at the website whenever you get a chance, and there's always something new there and something old that you can review.
Sure. Well, we're going to try and capture 2 episodes here today, but I'm going to let you go for now and just say thanks for your time today. But we're going to continue recording here in just a minute, and we're going to capture that next episode. But I felt like that was a good place to kind of wrap up today's episode, and we'll start with your regenerative journey into regenerative management with the next episode. So, Burke, thanks for your time today.
You bet. Thank you.
Very good stuff there. As always, as I said, this will be a 2-part conversation. Would really encourage you to tune in for part 2. Very excited to share that with you in a couple of weeks. Next on the Working Cows podcast, very excited to share with you a very special surprise guest for episode 300 of the Working Cows podcast. I've wanted to have this individual on since episode 2 with Dallas Mount of the Working Cows podcast. So going way back and finally getting to fulfill that. So I will be sharing that with you real soon on another episode of the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.